China is witnessing an unprecedented wave of defiance against its authoritarian regime. For the first time in years, Chinese citizens, led by university academics, are openly challenging the rule of President Xi Jinping. In a daring and rare move, a university dean and her deputy have published a signed manifesto calling for students to rise against the government. They demand democracy, freedom, and human rights, drawing eerie parallels to the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, a moment in history the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has tried to erase. But this time, the demand for change is not whispered in private. It is declared in the open. A few days ago, a Chinese university dean and her deputy released a signed manifesto urging students to challenge Xi Jinping's government. Echoing the spirit of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, the manifesto warns that if students do not stand up today, they will become another victim of history tomorrow. It calls for democracy, freedom, and human rights, painting a clear message. China must move away from lies and violence and embrace the rule of law and justice. Signing such a manifesto in China, especially now, is a breathtaking act of courage. It is a direct challenge to a regime known for crushing dissent. Just months ago, an economist who exposed the CCP's fabricated GDP figures disappeared without a trace. Yet, these professors are speaking out against Xi Jinping, a defiance almost unimaginable in a country where criticism of the government can lead to imprisonment, or worse. This open rebellion is a reminder of an era the CCP wants the world to forget, the massacre of June 4th, 1989. That day, thousands of students demanding democracy were killed by the Chinese military in Tiananmen Square. But the CCP has worked tirelessly to rewrite this history. Officially, the massacre never happened. Textbooks ignore it, websites censor it, and even mentioning the date can lead to arrest. Recently, pro-CCP accounts have gone so far as to falsely claim that it was Americans who died in Tiananmen, and this disinformation has spread to hundreds of thousands on social media. The CCP's use of bots to drown out the truth is no secret. Videos exposing the true story of Tiananmen are downvoted into obscurity, while propaganda thrives. When we tried to tell this story, our video was buried under an avalanche of CCP bot attacks, barely reaching 50,000 views. In contrast, CCP-backed falsehoods gained hundreds of thousands of views, an example of how the party uses technology to control narratives. To understand how China reached this point, we must look back at its history, beginning with Mao Zedong, the founding father of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao's brutal policies, from disastrous economic plans to the violent Cultural Revolution, left tens of millions dead. His legacy was one of oppression, and even after stepping down as chairman in 1959, he maintained an iron grip on the nation. But with Mao's death came change. Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatic leader, rose to power. Unlike Mao, Deng admired Singapore's model, an authoritarian state with a thriving economy. His famous phrase, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice," reflected his focus on economic success over ideological purity. Deng transformed China with economic reforms. But he was clear, political freedoms were not part of the deal. Deng's economic vision propelled China from poverty to prosperity, but it left a dangerous gap. The people became wealthier, but their political rights remained non-existent. Today, Xi Jinping's regime continues to enforce that trade-off, ruling with an even firmer grip. Yet the manifesto from these university professors suggests that the spirit of resistance is not entirely extinguished. Students, once again, are being called to stand against oppression. But will this call be another spark that the CCP extinguishes, or could it grow into something more? History has shown that ideas, once spoken, are hard to silence. China stands at a crossroads and the world is watching. Within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, a quiet struggle was brewing. While many leaders were satisfied with the status quo, some wanted something more. Political reforms, transparency, and even elements of what they dismissively called Western nonsense, like democracy. At the heart of this push was Hu Yaobang, a trusted protege of Deng Xiaoping. The two men had endured imprisonment together during Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, forging a deep bond. So in 1981, Deng appointed Hu as General Secretary of the CCP, the party's second highest position. Deng and Hu shared a vision for transforming China, but they differed on the pace. Both men wanted to establish a system of generational change in leadership. an effort to prevent older leaders from clinging to power. They envisioned a structure where younger leaders would take on decision-making roles, while veterans would retire at a reasonable age. But while Deng saw this as a slow, gradual process that could take 10 to 15 years, Hu was impatient. He was ready to step aside and allow young leaders to rise immediately. Hu had even identified promising young leaders, but his urgency alarmed some in the party. They saw his push not as a noble reform, but as a power grab, a way to strengthen his faction which favored openness and transparency. Deng himself was cautious. Although he liked the idea of generational change, he wasn't fully committed. Influential voices, including that of Li Peng, another close advisor, warned Deng that it was too soon for such sweeping changes. This division laid the groundwork for a crisis. Deng and Hu continued to push China through rapid economic reforms, but the speed of change brought problems. In the past, students graduating from universities were guaranteed jobs by the state, but under the new system, they were suddenly forced to compete for employment. Worse still, corruption was rampant. Job assignments were supposed to be based on merit, but in reality, party connections mattered more. Sons and daughters of officials received top positions without even being interviewed. Frustration spread across university campuses, culminating in a wave of protests in 1986. Students marched in the streets of major cities, demanding more fairness and freedom. The scale of the demonstrations shocked the government. Unlike during the Cultural Revolution, the CCP was determined not to lose control over student movements. Hu Yaobang, who had close ties to the students, sympathized with their demands. He refused to criticize their protests. His role technically required him to prevent any challenge to party policy, but he chose not to because he agreed with the students. They wanted more freedom, a fairer economic system, and faster reforms. All values Hu shared. Deng, however, saw the protests as a threat. He demanded swift action. His solution was simple: fire the two student leaders spearheading the protests, both of whom were party members. But Hu defied Deng's order. He refused to punish the students, insisting that young voices deserved a place in the party, not suppression. This act of defiance was a turning point. Deng forced Hu to resign as general secretary, a dramatic change. Hu had been the clear successor to Deng, the one expected to lead the party. But with him gone, Zhao Ziyang was chosen as the new general secretary. Li Peng, who represented the hardline communist faction, became premier, holding the third highest position in the CCP. Deng did not yet realize that Zhao Ziyang, Hu's replacement, also leaned toward reform. Zhao shared Hu's desire for more openness and a fairer society. His rise didn't resolve the ideological split within the party. Li Peng remained a staunch hardliner, loyal to Mao's vision of strict authoritarian rule. The CCP was now led by men with fundamentally opposing views. To solidify his control, the party forced Hu to publicly denounce his own actions. He was made to criticize his support for greater freedom and democracy, a humiliating spectacle designed to weaken his influence. But this strategy backfired. Instead of discrediting Hu, the move exposed the party's hostility to reform. To students and young activists, Hu became a symbol of resistance, someone who had dared to stand up for change. His forced resignation and public shaming only fueled their anger, setting the stage for an even greater conflict to come. Hu Yaobang's forced resignation had not silenced his supporters. Instead, it deepened their loyalty. To them, he was a man who stood by his convictions, someone who refused to abandon his beliefs even when pressured by the highest levels of power. Though he retained a nominal seat in the Politburo, his influence was gone, leaving him as little more than a figurehead. The pace of political reform slowed significantly. Deng Xiaoping and other senior leaders grew increasingly cautious, wary of empowering anyone who might share Hu's ideals of openness and transparency. On April 15, 1989, during an official meeting, Hu Yaobang suddenly felt dizzy. He asked to be excused, but as he stood to leave, he collapsed, suffering a fatal heart attack. One of China's most popular reformist leaders was gone. His death spread rapidly, and it struck a deep chord with students and workers across the country. To them, Hu had represented hope. Hope for freedom, democracy, and a more open society. His death felt like the end of that hope. What began as mourning quickly turned into something else. Students gathered, not just to grieve, but to protest. They marched through university campuses, shouting slogans calling for democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Petitions appeared, demanding that the party grant Hu a state funeral with the highest honors. By the next morning, the news had traveled even further. People began to gather at the monument to the people's heroes in Tiananmen Square. It started as a small, solemn crowd of around 200 people, but state newspapers covered the gathering, publishing pictures of the mourners. To most, this seemed like a simple act of public grief, but the CCP's leadership viewed it differently. Premier Li Peng was alarmed. He worried that the newspaper coverage would inspire even larger crowds. The consequences will be chaos in the social order, then he warned. But his fear did not stop the momentum. By the following day, the crowd in Tiananmen Square had swelled to 600. The government, recognizing the scale of public emotion, initially announced a high-level state funeral for Hu, allowing 4,000 people at the viewing ceremony and 100,000 at the memorial. Yet almost immediately Li Peng intervened, canceling the 100,000-person memorial. Allowing the masses to pay their respects will inevitably cause greater chaos, he argued. To the students, this decision was an outrage. It was not just a rejection of their demands, it was an insult to their right to mourn. Posters appeared across university campuses, calling on citizens to gather in Tiananmen Square. But these posters did more than just announce a memorial. They demanded change. They called for an end to autocratic politics, the creation of a democratic political order, and an investigation into the mistakes of the past decade of reforms, with those responsible held accountable. In response, thousands of students marched to Tiananmen Square, traveling through the night. They gathered at the entrance of the Great Hall of the People, demanding to meet with Premier Li Peng. They presented 7 key demands, the most significant being an official recognition that Hu Yaobang's views on democracy and freedom were correct. The demands were brought to Zhao Ziyang, the General Secretary, and here the divisions within the CCP became clear. Li Peng, an old-school communist, saw the protest as a direct threat to party control. He wanted to shut down the mourning, clear the square, and restore order. Zhao Ziyang, however, believed that allowing peaceful mourning was safer than trying to forcefully end it. Zhao's perspective was closer to Hu Yaobang's. He thought the party should listen to the students rather than suppress them, but Li Peng saw only chaos in their chants. He ordered the police to keep a close watch on the square, with instructions to suppress any signs of trouble immediately. But the movement was far from over. Each day saw more students arriving. By the next morning, the crowd had grown to 10,000. What began as a simple gathering to mourn a beloved leader had transformed into something much larger, a protest demanding change. The streets of Beijing were beginning to echo with the voices of a generation that would not be silenced. As police officers patrolled Tiananmen Square, they confronted 3 students standing alone and began harassing them. The students responded with defiant chants like, "Down with dictatorship! Seeking freedom is not a crime." Angered by the resistance, the officers escalated their aggression, beating the students so severely that one of them collapsed unconscious. Word of this brutality spread rapidly, reigniting the protest movement and drawing even more students into the struggle. Universities that had hesitated before now joined the protests, with many organizing their own marches to the square. Student leaders warned that if the CCP did not respond to their 7 demands soon, they would rally workers, farmers, intellectuals, and citizens from all walks of life. By the evening of April 21st, over 50,000 people had gathered at Tiananmen Square. This was the night before Hu Yaobang's memorial service, and the police were ordered to clear the streets for the country's top leaders, including Deng Xiaoping, Zhao Ziyang, and Li Peng. But the crowd kept growing, swelling to 400,000 by midnight, as students from countless universities came to honor Hu's memory. This was the largest unauthorized demonstration in China since the founding of the CCP in 1949. The military, realizing that force was useless against such a massive crowd, was forced to negotiate with student leaders. A deal was struck. The students would be allowed to mourn in peace if they maintained order. The following day, plans were set in motion for a military march into the city, as the head of the party took charge. The government issued an emergency order urging citizens to stay off the streets and avoid Tiananmen Square. When news spread that hundreds of thousands of soldiers were planning to enter the city again, people flooded the streets, hoping to defend the square as they had done a week earlier. At 8 p.m. on June 3, 1989, the military advance began. The army moved down Chang'an Avenue, determined to reach Tiananmen Square no matter the cost. When they met protester blockades, the soldiers fired rubber bullets and tear gas, while protesters retaliated by throwing rocks and bottles. When this did not deter the protesters, warning shots were fired into the air. After 10 minutes, it became clear that the protesters were not going to back down. And at 10:10 p.m., the soldiers were ordered to lower their weapons and fire into the crowd. The military began shooting indiscriminately, with tanks smashing through barricades and people alike, showing no regard for life. The protesters were stunned, unable to believe that their own army was firing live ammunition on them. As the soldiers pushed deeper into the city, the shooting grew even more reckless, taking the lives of protesters and innocent bystanders. Some soldiers even aimed at people watching from their apartment balconies. By 1:30 a.m., the troops reached Tiananmen Square from the west, and soon reinforcements arrived from other directions. By 2 a.m., the surviving students decided to leave the square as quickly as possible, realizing that staying meant greater danger. In the following hour, the student leaders reluctantly agreed to evacuate, following the CCP's demand to ensure everyone's safety. At 5:23 a.m., a Chinese military unit destroyed the Goddess of Democracy statue, starting by removing its severed torch. The next morning, many civilians attempted to re-enter the square, only to find it blocked off by the military. On April 22nd, the memorial proceeded as planned. The crowd was so massive that it stretched over 10 miles from the square's gates. Party leaders were stunned by the turnout, a sea of people mourning Hu Yaobang, whose legacy of reform had inspired them. But as the ceremony ended, frustration spread among the students. A group of them marched to the steps of the Great Hall of the People, kneeling with written demands in hand, but no official came out to acknowledge them. This silent rejection infuriated the students, and anger swept through the square. Some universities sent their students back home, but they didn't intend to remain silent. They announced an indefinite strike from classes until the government addressed their demands. The strike quickly spread beyond students, with teachers and workers also joining. As the protests continued, Zhao Ziyang left for North Korea, leaving Li Peng in charge. Zhao, known for his moderate stance, was gone, and Li viewed the protests as a threat. Convinced that dark forces were manipulating the students, he saw the movement as an organized conspiracy to destabilize the country. Acting on this belief, Li and his allies established the Central Committee Turmoil Suppression Group, tasked with cracking down on the unrest. Their first move was to consult Deng Xiaoping, securing his support for a strong response. Deng, now persuaded, authorized measures to quell the turmoil. He advised avoiding bloodshed if possible, but acknowledged that violence might be unavoidable. Li Peng quickly used this endorsement to escalate the situation, publishing an editorial in the state newspaper titled, "We must take a clear-cut stand against turmoil." The editorial framed the protests and mourning as violent and chaotic, accusing a small group of people with ulterior motives of inciting disorder. It effectively labeled the demonstrators as criminals and threats to national stability. This harsh condemnation transformed the protests from a spontaneous expression of grief into a full-scale political confrontation. Students who had gathered to honor Hu Yaobang were now being branded as traitors. They had come to defend Hu's vision of reform, but the party accused them of threatening China's stability. Outraged, student leaders publicly called for citizens across the country to join them in denouncing the editorial. The government responded by announcing that the official mourning period for Hu Xiaobang was over, and that further demonstrations would be considered illegal. But the students refused to back down. They announced a massive march for April 27th, knowing they were defying government orders and risking severe consequences. For them, this was no longer just about mourning a beloved leader. It had become a struggle for freedom, justice, and a voice against a government that saw their demands for democracy as a threat.